Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about why people quit. I recently did a video called Eating Your Own Dog Food about if you make a product, in particular a game, you should use it, you should play it, you should eat your own dog food. In the comment section, a lot of people were asking about people who don't eat their own dog food, and more particularly, why those people would even be in the industry or stay in the game industry if they didn't play games. And I thought I'd address that in this video, like drill down on it, because I've been in the industry in just a couple months. It will be 44 years. So in a couple months, I enter my 45th year of working in the game industry. And in that entire time, I've only been an employee at 5 companies. I've done some consulting and contract work, but I've only been an employee at 5 companies in 44 years. What's interesting is I've only quit twice. There were 2 companies, Cybron, the one that made Grand Slam Bridge, and my own company, Troika, that closed. So I technically didn't quit. There was no company to be at anymore. And then Obsidian, I've been working for Obsidian now for 14 years. A mix of employee and contracting. By the way, that's twice as long as any other company I've ever worked at, including my own. Which right there should tell you something about Obsidian. 14 years and counting. And I mentioned I've quit twice in my career. And if you want to know more about that, I've got videos about it. I quit once from exhaustion from Interplay. I'll link the video below. It's when I quit Fallout 2. And then once from frustration from Carbine when I was working on WildStar. And I'll link that video below. So I'm not going to rehash that. But I just want to point out that in 5 companies, quit twice, 2 of them went under, 1 I'm still at. However, this question about why people quit has been asked of me for a long time. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story now that happened in the 90s. And it was at Interplay. This would be about 1995. I had been there since 91. 91 as a contractor and then full-time employee starting at 92. I was just starting up Fallout. Fallout had started in 94. Interplay had been really stable in the sense of nobody had ever really quit. Not a large number. Some people had been fired, but nobody had ever really quit, except a few rare instances, and it was very obvious why. Like maybe their spouse was moving, or they were leaving the game industry altogether. But suddenly, in 1995, more and more people were quitting, and they weren't leaving the game industry. And I think it was freaking out upper management, because I was asked to come in by one of the upper management to get my opinion on why this was happening. And at the time, I was wondering why they asked me, but later on, I found out I was a manager, but I was still kind of in the trenches. I spent most of my day programming and designing. Plus, I did a lot of stuff after hours. I played board games with people and video games. We went to parties. We went to dinner all the time. So basically, the person who asked me said they thought I really had my finger on the pulse of Interplay, which I never thought of. But I didn't know why he wanted me in his office. But he basically said, "Why do you think people are quitting all of a sudden?" And I thought about it for a second, and I said, I think a better question, something that would be more informative, is to ask why people don't quit. And he said, "Okay, why don't people quit?" And I said, "That's simpler." I said, "It's the 3 I's: ignorance, inertia, and apathy." And maybe, like you're doing right now, yelling at the screen, he kind of yelled at me, "Apathy doesn't start with I." And I just went, "I don't care." And after a bit of a laugh, and also being reminded that insufferable also begins with I, he said, "Could you explain that in detail, please?" And I said, "Okay, let's dive into it." And this is what I said. And you got to remember, This was back in the 90s. So the first thing I said is a big reason people stay here that I can tell is ignorance. They literally don't know they're being underpaid. They don't know they're being underutilized. They don't know about other jobs. It's hard to find a game company, much less open positions at game companies, much less open positions at other game companies that you qualify for. So ignorance was a big chunk of employee retention in the 80s and 90s. If you got a job at a game company, you counted your lucky stars and where were you going to go? But that was changing. Game companies were becoming hot. There were more and more springing up, especially in California, especially in Southern California. So suddenly there were options, and people weren't quite so ignorant about those options anymore. The second reason I said was inertia. That's different than ignorance. Inertia folks knew maybe there were other things they could be doing, but they were just very happy with the status quo. These were people who were, for lack of a better word, working for the weekend. And I had somebody actually tell me that. He had a job with very little responsibilities, and it paid okay. It didn't pay that well. But he pointed out to me, he said he lived in a place he shared with 3 other people. What he liked doing on the weekend was 4-wheeling in the desert. Joshua Tree. He liked going up to Anza-Borrego or out the Salton Sea. And so he liked not having a lot of responsibilities. And he was being paid enough that as a young 20-something, he could do what he wanted every weekend. And he was happy with that. That was a status quo. He didn't leave to get another job because he didn't even look for another job. He was happy with the way things were. So that was the inertia. So that finally brings us to the apathy, which I think is a different thing than inertia. The apathy is, quite frankly, the I don't care people. They weren't looking for anything else because this was just a job to them. They showed up, did their work, got paid, went home. I talk about that in my jobs, callings, and career video. I'll link that below. That's what they did. That's all they did. That's what they were happy about. I shouldn't say happy. They didn't care. Work didn't annoy them. Or if it did, it didn't annoy them enough to make any kind of changes. They were just like, I don't care. I don't care about this game. I don't care about this work, but I'm making money. And it's subtly different than the inertia folks. The inertia folks were happy with where they were. The apathy folks weren't, but they also didn't care enough to go anywhere else. And I said, apathy, I think, has kept a lot of people here. I know a lot of apathetic folks. And keep in mind, this is the 90s. I hear people saying this all the time in the 2020s like this is brand new. It isn't. We talked about this at length, in depth. And it ended with him going, I don't agree with anything you said. And I'm like, okay. But Interplay kept losing people. And I think that those 3 eyes played a big part because each group, the ignorant group was getting smaller. The inertia group was getting smaller, especially as people got older. And the apathy group was pretty much the only group that was remaining. But you can't run a game company on apathy. I still think that these 3 reasons that people don't quit, I think that still applies today. The proportions may have changed on what percentage of people who just stick with their job is ignorance versus inertia versus apathy. But I think that's the 3 primary reasons people don't quit their jobs. So I'm curious what you guys think. I wanted to tell those stories and see what you think. Why do you think people quit? Or more importantly, why do you think people don't quit?